Well, thank you, Jeremy. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I acknowledge you, Jeremy, as the president of the Australian Zionist Federation, Alon Kasuto, who I've just met. I hope I said that right. Rhymes with prosciutto, I was told. I was also told it was the kosher type of prosciutto. So I'm glad to get that right. Alon is, as you know, the CEO of the Australian Zionist Federation. Amir Mammon, my dear friend, the ambassador of Israel. It's great to see you here. Josh Burns, who's the member for Macmahon. Is it Michelle? I'm just talking Michelle. Oh, yeah, there you are, Michelle Anandavaraja, who's the member for Higgins. Great to see you all here as well. And there are so many distinguished people in this room. And I do very much feel like I am amongst friends. And I really thank you, Jeremy, for your comments about Mum. Mum was 98. She had a great innings. It's still a very, as anyone knows, a significant moment when the moment arrives. But as I said to Jeremy outside, amidst a lot of emotion over the last few days, one of them is definitely a sense of feeling enormous pride at being Marles' son. And I felt that growing up, and I feel that very much today. I don't have prepared text today. So in a sense, I'm speaking a bit more from the heart than I spoke from the heart when I spoke to you before, but that was a prepared text, which I really wanted on that occasion to try and, articulate a connection which I believe existed and continues to exist between Australia and Israel, and particularly between the history of the Australian Labor Party and Israel. That was very much part of what I was seeking to do on that day. The comments that I made about the significance of Israel, not just to the Jewish diaspora, obviously to the citizens of Israel themselves, but to the world, I very much still hold. I think it was the World Zionist Congress in 1946 where there really was a sense of a demand for justice, or that justice would not be met unless there was the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that particularly was the case, obviously, after the Holocaust, but not just that, after the decisions that had been taken by the British government at that time around immigration to Palestine of Jewish people. And there's a certain moral imperative about the existence of Israel, which anyone in this room who's visited Yad Vashem, and I'm sure many of you have, is just so manifest. Israel must exist, and a lot flows from that. It requires thinking through what that means in terms of the region, but it requires also thinking through what it means for a country to exist and to exist with security and with safety. It's not just a matter of a country existing within, that it's there. And people need to have a sense of security so that they can build a state, build lives, build prosperity, which is, I guess, to quote Jefferson, about the pursuit of happiness, which is the right of every nation. And obviously that was shattered on October 7. And when I last spoke to you, I think it was literally this time last year in Sydney, which would have been just a few weeks after October 7. And it was just before. Oh, okay. Well, so this is the first time we've met since October 7. Well, obviously what occurred on that date shattered any notion of people being able to pursue that happiness within a context of security in Israel. And the last year has been really difficult. It's been difficult for the government, but that really pales into insignificance compared to what it has been for you. And I want to come back to that in a moment. But to deal for a moment in the substantive issue, so much has played out. It is complex, that's to state the obvious. Jeremy described us as trying to plot a middle course. I think we have tried to navigate a course. People will judge, history will judge our success or not in that. In doing so, we have very much from the outset made clear and sought to call out the outrage of October 7, where that outrage came from, that it was Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation, that the victims of that outrage were not combatants, they were innocents, people going about their lives, attending concerts, thinking about peace, actually, and just the most appalling atrocities were committed on that day. We sought to make clear that in response to that, Israel has a right to defend itself, and that what that means is a right to respond to the actions that are being perpetrated on Israel, be that Hamas, be that Hezbollah, be that the Houthis, be that Iran itself. And that responding means that, and means that Israel is able to do so in terms of trying to affect an outcome not just in the short term but in the long term. We acknowledge all that, and we've sought to say all of that. We have sought to say that there are limits to the right to self-defence because there are limits to everything, and that no one in any context escapes history. It was Lincoln during the Second World War who talked about the inescapable judgment of history and an acknowledgement of that in the present. And history will judge all of our actions, and that does simply imply that there are limits on whatever happens, and that in the process of that, it's impossible not to acknowledge the deaths of tens of thousands of innocents in Gaza. And that's a number and a statement that is accepted on both sides. And it's got to be possible to make that statement with meaning. And I think everyone in this room acknowledges that, but we also then need to think through what that means. And so in the context of all of that, we've sought to navigate the path that we have, has to be said with criticism from just about everyone. And we've sought to, I guess, add our voice to that of the international community in seeking to bring about peace, not peace on any terms, peace on terms which enables Israel to exist within secure borders, and of course, peace on terms which see a return to of the hostages. And I haven't mentioned that. The taking of the hostages was an unspeakable act, and remains a huge part of the landscape of what has occurred, and no peace can occur unless there is a return of those hostages. As I say, people will judge whether or not the path that we've negotiated in trying to articulate all of that has been successful or not. I also, though, want to say something about what's happened here in Australia. Because as much as it matters how we exercise our voice internationally, we ultimately are the only ones, I don't mean by that the government, I mean all of us, are the only ones responsible for what life looks like in our own country. If we were to wind the clock back, 18 months, I would have said that the version of multiculturalism which exists in Australia, the celebration of that, the tolerance, the diversity, but more than the tolerance actually, the celebration of each other's heritages and histories, was as good a version of this as you could find anywhere on the planet. I have found, no doubt you have found in much greater degree, that the last 12 months have been very confronting in the context of having had that sense of our nation. I think what we've seen in the last 13 months has asked the question about all of that. And at different times in our history, different heritages and ethnicities have seen a spike in prejudice in respect of them. But in the last 13 months, I think what is really clear is that anti-Semitism particularly is in a place that I just find unimaginable. And whatever that means in terms of my observation, I genuinely, and I really mean this, find it hard to imagine what it is to live that for you. At this moment, at this point in my remarks, it's hard to not be tried. I mean, this country is as much yours as it is mine or anyone else's. You have a right to live here free of prejudice as much as I do or anyone else does. And that clearly is not what's being experienced in Australia today. And it's utterly unacceptable. When I look at Jerry Seinfeld being protested, I'm not sure that Jerry Seinfeld said anything about the Middle East. There's only one reason that Jerry Seinfeld could be the subject of protest, and that he's Jewish. I mean, how can that protest be anything other than anti-Semitic? I've had attacks on my office, but no one's sought to burn it down. That's what's happened to Josh. It's what's happened to Mark. Why has it happened to Josh and Mark? And only Josh and Mark. Josh and I went to Mount Scopus. Josh is a good Mount Scopus boy. 3 months ago, I think? Okay, well, maybe not such a good Mount Scopus boy, but I've always understood he certainly says he was a good Mount Scopus boy, but we went there, and actually it was actually a great thing to go there with Josh, and it was Josh, a dear friend of mine. It was a really lovely experience in that sense, but it was also confronting. The security to get into Mount Scopus is like getting into Parliament. It's better, actually. Well, probably. But kids shouldn't have to do that. Kids should not have to do that. And when I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but it's millions of dollars a year, which the community, the school, which I guess is the community of the school, is spending on that. That's a burden that is deeply unfair. We went that day to speak out against anti-Semitism and to stand in solidarity with those students after a horrendous thing had been written on their wall. I can only say to you that I will continue to seek to do that. I don't know what the answer to this is. I know that obviously leadership matters. We seek to provide that leadership. It is your absolute right, and actually it's really important that it's more than that. It's kind of your duty to call out whether we do that well or not. And I stand ready to hear that criticism. I really do mean that. But it is really important that we try and navigate a path in this country back to what we had, where we were genuinely celebratory about the social cohesion of our nation. And that will be unfinished business as long as anti-Semitism is given a voice in this nation. Now, with those words, Jeremy, I might...
Sure. Why don't we sit down?
Yep.
We don't have long, but we've got time for a little bit. So I might just prerogative of the chair and start. So Richard, I think you made an important comment in relation to Israel's right to defend itself, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because I think this is where many in the Jewish community sort of, at times scratch our head or just feel very frustrated. And that is, to many in this room, the idea of saying, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, but at the same time calls for a ceasefire, for example, and de-escalation. Both in relation to Gaza and Lebanon, it's sort of, it feels like those two things are mutually exclusive. And certainly at points in time, they're mutually exclusive. We know that if Israel didn't go into Rafah, they wouldn't have got Sinwar. If they would have had a ceasefire in Lebanon, they wouldn't have got Nasrallah. But I think stepping back from that, so you're right though, of course you're right, that everything has limitations. And by the way, I don't think any reasonable people, and I think most of the people in this room are reasonable, has any problem. Most, not all, there's always a few exceptions. But I think the most reasonable people would accept that it is part of the Australian government's role to at times, ask questions about the conduct of the war. As Australians ask questions about the conduct of wars that Australia are involved in. We all have seen, the allegations and issues that have arisen in Afghanistan with the ADF. That is democracy, and that is perfectly acceptable. But if I had to try, and it's not easy, but just to explain why the community, I think, feels like something more fundamental has shifted. I think it's because it's often what else is not said or what else is said. So, for example, yes, there are limitations and reasonable discussions around what the limits are. But, there is a limit to what we really know and what the Australian government can know here, right, in terms of the conduct of the war. And that makes things difficult. And what I guess we'd expect is a lot more trust in the fact that Israel is a democracy, right, is fighting this broader battle against Islamic terrorism. And it doesn't feel like the positions that Israel's taken, it's often under the banner of a Netanyahu government. And yes, there are lots of problems with Netanyahu. That's no secret. But I think that's often used as a bit of a sort of an excuse. And when you have those judgment calls made and limitations imposed on Israel, and at the same time, you've got ministers in the government. You've Jason Clare on TV, I watched it live myself, said Israel is responsible for war crimes, is breaching international law. Now, that's not the position of the government, as far as I know. I haven't heard that as a formal position, yet you've got a minister in the government saying it. You've got Ed Husic that drew a comparison between 9/11 and what is happening now with Israel being compared to Al-Qaeda. You have both ministers in the government saying things which I think many people assume to cater to the sort of electorate that they're in and the challenges that they're under and the pressures they're under, but they are ministers in the government, and we don't see the reverse. We don't see this balanced out. So I guess what I'm saying is, what sort of reassurance? There are many in this room looking for hope. What can you tell us in responses to reassure us?
Yeah. So thank you for that, Jeremy. And look, I mean, Jeremy and I have spoken a lot, and I do, quite genuinely thank Jeremy for his friendship and his counsel, but also the conversations we've been able to have around this. So I understand that I definitely understand the question, and like Amir and I have talked about this too. If we are to all honestly kind of try and think this through, there is a lot that that everyone in the room doesn't know. I mean, that you made that point, and that's fair. That's true. One of the things that I definitely feel now that I am the Defence Minister, but it's something I understood as the Shadow Defence Minister, is that there's a massive difference to being in the in the command centre with all the information at your fingertips compared to not. And also, there is a whole lot of information that can only exist within the command centre and really cannot be allowed to be out in the public domain. All of what's in the command centre ultimately does get judged by history. I mean, it does become public at some point down the track. We will know. Like, there will be a reckoning in one form or another of all that has happened, because that is what happens. That's what history does. So all of us are, to an extent, if we are being honest, dealing with an incomplete set of facts. And the question then is, how do we kind of intelligently articulate our voice in the context of that? One of the things that we have sought to do is to speak in terms of principles, which is what I did when I was at the lectern, about how we have navigated our way through this. It isn't right to say that it's not necessarily right to say that a call for a ceasefire and a right to defend yourself are mutually exclusive, if what one is saying is that in a call for a ceasefire, it is not on any terms, it is on specific terms. The question is whether one can, you can get there. And we've made clear Israel has a right to exist with security within its borders, and the hostages must be returned. And that is, the basics of any ceasefire. But it's more than that. We've also made it clear that Israel has a right to defend itself, which means to respond, and that means affecting change in the long term. And that's clearly what Israel is seeking to do. You know, we are saying those things. Whether, you know, ultimately what history is going to do is work out whether or not all the steps and the actions that were taken have been, I mean, it will judge Israel. It's going to judge us. It's going to judge Hamas, but it will judge Israel. And will all the steps, you know, it will make the judgment as to whether all the steps that the Israeli government have taken have been consistent with those principles. You know, it's hard to say more than that. Like, it's literally hard for anyone in this room to say more than that, because none of us are in the command centre. That's the truth. And you can articulate principles from outside, but you can't know whether a particular strike or a particular action, you know, was appropriate or not. Like, you just can't. Now that also, you know, means that it's important not to express. You know, I hear the message very clearly that, but aren't. That's what you kind of said. But aren't people expressing a concluded judgment on those things in a negative sense? Yeah, I mean, that can't be done. That shouldn't be done either. You know, like But in the midst of all the principles that exist, the protection of innocence and innocent Palestinians is part of it too. Has to be, obviously. And you know, I've heard. You know, I've had the experience of meeting with the IDF. I've had the experience of going to the Israeli Department of Defence. The ethical standards of the IDF are a matter of pride for the IDF. That's how they will talk about it themselves. So I've got no doubt if there was an IDF commander sitting here right now, they would be saying that the protection of innocent lives in Gaza matters. It has to. And, you know, and we've seen tens of thousands of those lives lost. It's impossible not to acknowledge that. And I guess, you know, that's what we've sought to do. We have found that to kind of make any commentary in this, in any of these contexts, brings criticism. But, you know, with all the kind of inadequacies of trying to do what we can in this moment, that's what we've been trying to do.
Thanks, Richard. So I'll open it up so we have we have an opportunity to. I'll just stand so I can see. Okay, Dion. You got a question?
Normally, there's this sort of reticence to put a hand up, but obviously it's a very different room.
And I'm sorry, we're not going to have enough time for that many questions, but we'll go through them as quickly as we can. Dion.
Thanks. Richard, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Sorry for your loss. As one in the defence manufacturing industry here in Australia, I read recently about the Department of Defence reviewing export permits, defence-related export permits to Israel. And traditionally, I wouldn't have thought that was something Australia would have done. So can you please provide some comment on that and what Australia's position is in that regard and why the review?
Well, I mean, we have examined all of our exports to Israel, but, you know, the export regime that the defence export regime that we have to the world is a kind of yes, there are principles and there is lists, but there's things happen on a case-by-case basis is what I'm trying to say. There's not a lot of there's not really much activity in terms of exports to Israel, is the truth. But I want to just sort of put that in context. There is definitely Israeli defence industries, Elbit, Rafael, I think IAI, but certainly Elbit and Rafael, you know, make a significant contribution to Australia's defence capability. And so in the context of that, there is stuff going back and forth between Australia and Israel, which is actually not for Israel, it's ultimately for Australia, but it might be, it goes to Israel to be worked on to come back to Australia, but that will require an export in terms of how our regime works. Both countries are part of the F-35 program, and not just users of the F-35, but participators in the supply chain of the F-35. So in fact, I've been to the IAI facility at Ben Gurion, or next to Ben Gurion, which forms part of the supply chain to a number of the F-35. So supply chains are integrated in the construction of the F-35s, which are used by both Defence Forces. So there is that. There's not really much that happens beyond that. As we have looked at this, and again, it's difficult to go into it publicly in a detailed way, we have tried to do this consistently with how our friends and like-minded countries are doing this as well. So we are not alone in terms of examining this, and we're going through that process.
Yep, got a question standing up. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming. A question about, thank you. You mentioned the innocent before. I want to ask about the innocent here in Australia. The innocent Jewish people, members of the community, and their right to feel safe in their own country. The right to go to university and not feel intimidated. The right not to be faced with hate speech, incitement to violence. And the rhetoric is there to a certain degree, but sometimes it needs to move to action. And the sense, I'm sure, of many other in this room, if not all, is that didn't take place. We feel that we've been abandoned by the government. There was no action, and we haven't seen any enforcement of laws that exist to protect us and make us feel safe. And this is something that goes beyond just the Jewish community as a community, because when we see the radical left, together with the Islamists, combining into old Soviet Union propaganda to undermine the bigger picture in the Australian society, we expect our government to take action rather than just words to protect us and prevent those groups from undermining the entire cohesion and multiculturalism that you mentioned that we used to have.
So thank you for that question, and as I guess my words at the outset, I hope indicated, I don't know whether my answer is going to be adequate. But I'd say a few things. Firstly, I completely acknowledge it, as I did. I've never seen anti-Semitism like it in this country, and things have happened in the last year which I couldn't believe would have happened in Australia. Just couldn't believe it. No doubt you feel the same, only in a completely different degree. You're right. It's not just the Jewish community. Every community has a right to have a sense of security. Being secure is not an objective test, it's a subjective test, meaning you're only secure, you are not secure until you feel you are secure, if that makes sense. As long as the Jewish community are saying to governments that they feel a sense of insecurity, then they are insecure. Like that's what I mean by the fact that this is a subjective test. We need to be, the government, but the country needs to be at a point where communities are not having that feeling, and I absolutely acknowledge that that's where the Jewish community, how it feels and reasonably feels today. I totally get it. You mentioned campus. I think that's 100% right. I think what we've seen on campuses has been unacceptable around Australia, and Jewish students on campus have a right to be able to be there, to be kids basically, and enjoy what it is to be on campus like anyone else. That has to change. There's an ongoing dialogue about how we can help and what we can do. That obviously needs to continue, but all I can really say to you, and I completely acknowledge that where we're at the moment has not has not left the Jewish community feeling like they are secure, and therefore they are not. You are not. And we need to be continuing to work with you and do everything we can until you answer that question in a different way.
We've got one more, Moran.
Prioritised politics and retaining seats over what is right. What's your response to that?
Look, I mean, obviously I don't accept that. That's not going to be a surprise to you that I would say it, but I genuinely don't believe that. And I do feel, like I've watched parties across the political spectrum engage in behaviours that have been political, over the course of the last year. But in a sense, I think to dwell on that takes this to the very place that I wish it wasn't, which is in a place of partisanship. It's got to be above politics. We've got to try and navigate this against a backdrop of what's right and how, what's right in terms of how Australia expresses its view, its voice in the world, what's right in terms of the kind of society that we have at home and the security, the cohesion that people feel, as we've discussed. Those are not issues which should divide the parties. I mean, no reasonable person could disagree with the idea that we want to have a socially cohesive society, that the situation internationally is complex and that we need to be exercising our voice internationally with sincerity. Like, really, this shouldn't be a political issue. I definitely think, that as a put it this way, as a class, as a polity, I don't think that, I've seen a lot of politics being played. I feel, and I genuinely feel, that the path that we have tried to navigate has been a path which has not had that at its core. Meaning what we have been seeking to do is to make the right calls. Now, whether or not people accept that in this room is, of course, a matter for you. But I do know the conversations that have been had, which have led to the various decisions that have been made and the statements that have been given. And I can assure you that politics is not what has driven this government's voice or this government's actions.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there with the questions. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
But let me say that before Michael Borski comes to do a formal vote of thanks, every time I've spoken to Richard since the 7th of October, he has said, Jeremy, if you want me to come, I'll be there. If I need to be a punching bag, I'll be a punching bag. And so, I think there is obviously, I think, a lot of, demand and interest in having this dialogue. And maybe what we'll do is we'll look to find another opportunity to have this conversation, because I think it's important. And I think even if people walk away not entirely satisfied, inevitably that is what happens on these sorts of issues. It's important that we continue to talk. And, the Ambassador made the same point. So on that note, Michael, I'll ask if you...
It's not an easy thing to do, to stand before a room like this or sit when one is even just of average political astuteness and intelligence, and Richard's well above that, and can anticipate that a great number of people in this room are feeling disappointed and insecure and uncertain. And as Deputy Prime Minister, you didn't have to come today. And as Richard Marles face, it's a particularly difficult time for you to have come today. And we know that Richard Marles is a genuine friend of ours and of Israel's. And although from time to time, and especially at the moment, a number of us do have points of significant disagreement with the government you represent, We are extremely grateful to you for being here today and for listening and for sharing your thoughts with us and for the work we know you do in Cabinet and in other places to try to advance our cause. And by our cause, I mean protection against anti-Semitism and really the liberal view of multicultural Australia that we all cherish and wish to see again. So thank you very, very much for coming today.